Equality, and as shown here, we're at a much worse point than we've been at any point in the last 50 years. So that's the first thing. I also wanted to show you this. So this is what's happened in recent years with more detailed data. Now, we don't have income achievement gaps with this level of data. This is Nateman state test score data showing the black-white gap over the last 20 years. And you can see we've made very slight progress over the last 20 years or so in terms of black-white test score gaps, whether we measure it by NAEP or whether we measure the state test. At this rate, it would take about 75 years for the black-white gap to go away. So this is by way of saying we're not there yet in terms of racial achievement gaps, but we're certainly closer than we are in terms of economic achievement gaps. Third thing I want to show you is this. This is the trends in college completion for high and low income children from high and low income families over the last 20 years. So this is cohorts of kids who were born in the early 60s compared to cohorts who were born in the early 80s. And so we've made very little progress at the low end. So if you look at low income students, college completion rates have gone up very modestly over that 20-year period, from 5% to 9%, whereas for high-income kids, college completion rates have gone up dramatically. So the gap in sort of college completion by family background has widened over the same time as well. This is four-year college. This is similar to the picture Lane showed you before. So why has this been happening? Well, one story, of course, is income inequality. This is the share of all income in the U.S. going to the top 10% of earners. So Elaine showed you the top 1%. This is the top 10%. And of course, in the 50s and 60s and into the 70s, economic inequality was very low. The top 10% earned about a third of all income. Now they earn about half of all income. Here's a different way of looking at income inequality that's particularly relevant for children. This is the ratio of the income of the 90th percentile family to the 10th percentile family among families with children. And so when we're thinking about school-age kids, this is the population we want. And back in 1970, that ratio was less than 5. A high-income family earned less than 5 times as much as a low-income family. That ratio now is almost 10. So the gap in terms of dollars of income of children who are growing up in high and low-income families is roughly double where it was 40 years ago. So why has the income achievement gap been growing? Well, let me suggest a few possible reasons. Is it because schools are getting worse? That's sort of an obvious answer. Let me show you this one first. So this is a study where children were followed from kindergarten all the way through 8th grade, and at each number of points in time, we measured the gap between high and low income children in terms of their achievement. Now, if we thought that schools were responsible for producing most of this gap, we might think that the gap would start out relatively small when children got to school and then get a lot wider over time. But what we see here is that the gap when kids enter kindergarten, and in a different study, even when they're age 4, the gap is 1.25 standard deviations. That's enormous. And it doesn't get a lot bigger by 8th grade. So most of this gap between high and low income kids is happening in early childhood. Schools aren't doing aren't going down. Now, they're not going up as much as we would like, but schools aren't getting worse. And in fact, if you look at 4th graders in math and 4th graders in reading, scores have gone up substantially. The average 9-year-old now has math skills equal to the average 11-year-old 30 years ago. Okay, so math skills are going up substantially, reading skills less so, and not so much progress in the later grades. But there's no evidence here that test scores are going down in any subject or at any grade level, which suggests that schools aren't getting worse. It's not to say they're as good as we want them to be. And if we looked more carefully at this by family background, we would say that it's either going up faster for high-income kids and not going up as fast for low-income kids, which is why we see that gap that I showed you before widening. Another thing that's been happening over the last 40 years is that income segregation, residential segregation by income, has been going up dramatically. Residential segregation by race hasn't changed a whole lot in 40 years. It's moderately lower than it was 30 to 40 years ago, but not dramatically. But segregation by income has gone up substantially. So this shows you the reds and the blues sort of indicate the kind of income level of a neighborhood. So the reds are very poor neighborhoods with median incomes well below their average of the metropolitan area. And blues are ones that are very affluent. They have median incomes well above the average of the metro area. And what the vertical dimension shows you is what percentage of families live in such neighborhoods. So in 1970, about 15% of families lived in either very affluent or very poor neighborhoods, and 2/3 of all families lived in very mixed income, kind of middle class neighborhoods. Now, over 1/3 of all families, up from 15%, live in these very affluent or very poor neighborhoods, and only 43% of families, down from 66% of families, live in these sort of mixed income neighborhoods. So as income inequality has widened, so has the sort of spatial residential segregation between high and low income families, which then has implications for the kind of schools they go to, the kinds of preschool and child care opportunities they might have access to, lots of other features of neighborhoods that matter for kids' development. So this may be a factor that's contributing to it. The last trend I want to point out is that families are increasingly spending lots more money on their children. This is sort of a long 20th century trend where childhood has become sort of more and more important. Families spend lots more time and money on their kids. But that's much more true of high-income families than it is for low-income families. So this shows in 2008 dollars the average amount of investments in enrichment activities that families spend on their children. And so in the early 70s, high-income families spent about 4 times as much as low-income families on these enrichment activities. That ratio now is about almost 7 times. So now high-income families are spending almost 7 times as much as low-income families. So while we've seen increases in spending on children in general, we've seen much more of that at high-income families, and that may help explain what's going on in terms of early childhood and this widening gap. So what does this all suggest? Well, I think it suggests a few things. One is that the academic achievement gap between high and low-income kids is growing dramatically, and that's a big problem because the labor market increasingly rewards high levels of educational skill and high levels of educational attainment. The returns to a college degree are much greater than they used to be. And so if the children of the rich increasingly do better in school, and if those who do better in school increasingly have access to the high-wage jobs, we end up in a society where the American dream becomes sort of less and less possible. It's harder and harder to sort of move from a low-income background to one where your children can experience, sort of all the fruits and benefits of the American economy. And so this sort of really calls into question, I think, the potential for the American dream to happen. It also suggests, I think, that investments in early childhood are perhaps the one place we ought to think seriously about. That is, it's going to be much easier to prevent these gaps from happening in early childhood than it's going to be to try to remedy them after kids have entered school. And while we should do certainly more in K-12 schooling to reduce these gaps, I think it's unrealistic to think that schools alone can reduce a gap that's this big. I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Peter.
I'm going to really quickly just note that all of these presentations will be available on our website starting next week. So for all of you who are taking fantastic notes, the actual slides will be up there for you to use.
Well, thank you so much, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm the person of different knowledge. I'm not here as an education person. But Sean, of course, laid the total and perfect groundwork as we strategize for what I'm going to say. I'm the poverty guy, right? And so I want to just start by saying what I hope is obvious. It's why BBA exists, which is that we need to really desperately, to all of us who care about children, care about poverty, and care about education in particular, since that's the kind of entry point of the discussion today, to get on the same page. And that is that it's time to stop arguing about whether schools can do it all or not. This is about, if we're going to have a proper future for our children, it's about wonderful schools, schools that are successful, and it's about full-scale attack on poverty in our country. Both and, not either or. Wonderful schools could do a lot for children who come from very, very low-income backgrounds, but they can't do nearly as much as they would do if we had much less poverty. So I could stop right there. That's my main point. But in thinking about who's responsible for what, those of you who work on schools need to be part of a kind of a public dialogue that makes that point that I just made over and over again. But others need to do the heavy lifting and the advocacy in some of these other areas. There's some things that BBA talks about that actually should be going on in schools that will help low-income kids do better in school. But there's a lot, and Sean really referred to it really explicitly in what he told you and showed you, that is very, very big stuff in a larger or different large frame. So just to emphasize a few points about what we need to be concentrating on, other than education, K-12 or P14, whatever we say, other than the early childhood development that's so important, other than, or now here I'm getting over to what I will talk about, the mobility piece. We need to recognize that very significantly we've become a low-wage country. And that part of what needs to happen is serious focus on that. We generally think that people are in particular economic trouble if their incomes are below twice the poverty line, which by the traditional measure is below about $44,000 for a family of four. That number, most of you are aware of this, but to those who already know, I apologize. Anyway, 103 million people, a third of the people in our country, have incomes below twice the poverty line. And that's just increased phenomenally over the last 40 years, and especially over the last 10 years. So what is all that about? Well, I see Larry Michel sitting out there, and I always quote EPI's numbers. The wages for the median level job, in other words, half the jobs in this country, have just been stopped. All of that, things that you saw and that you know about the 99% and the 1% and so on, I don't know that people have really focused or understand how stuck the wages are for low-wage jobs. It's half the jobs in the country that I'm talking about. And, you know, we can go through all the reasons for that. It's a lot to do with the good jobs going away to technology and other countries, but it also relates to unions and stagnation of the minimum wage and so on. So the wage, adjusted for inflation, of the median job in the country has gone up by 7% in 40 years. A fifth of a percent a year. That's astonishing. That median job now pays $33,000. Half the jobs under that, a quarter of the jobs in the country pay less than the poverty line for a family of four, less than $22,000. So we need to get that out on the table. I think that's a very politically salient number because there's so many people out there who are hurting, who don't understand that what's hurting them is structural. It's not their fault. And looking forward, there's a debate that we have to have. Sean expressed doubts that obviously many people have about where the economy is going. We're going to have a lot of low-wage work. And so one of the reasons why we need the top 1% to pay the fair share, although that's not the only place where we're going to get the resources that we need, is because we have to talk about how to get more income for all of those low-wage workers. The first place to get it is from employers, and so that's about the minimum wage, and each of these would be a longer conversation. There's some starting finally now, or again actually, we had it in the first part of the last decade, state-level campaigns to raise the minimum wage. That's good. Anything that we can do to strengthen unions would be helpful. And then we need to think about all of the different things that we need to do anyway that have an income effect. Because if you get health care for everybody, that has an income effect. If you have assistance with child care, that has an income effect. With housing, with the cost of going to college. Even if we do all of those things, I would suggest we're going to have a shortfall. And that's why we have wage supplementation, at least for families with kids, in the name of the Earned Income Tax Credit. And of course, we find now, along with the attack on food stamps that Elaine mentioned, we have people saying, well, it's just terrible that almost half the American people don't pay federal income taxes. Well, there's a reason why they don't. They don't have enough income to live on, and at least that's a piece of public policy. You saw the story in the New York Times the other day about the income tax credit. So that's a very, very important thing, and it works. Along with food stamps, it's a public policy success. And the fact is, if we're going to be straightforward and honest about our situation with so many people struggling with low-wage work, we need to say that, to understand that we're actually not going to get everything that we want over the coming years in wages. We're going to have to add the wages with public policy. So there's that part of it, and then there's the safety net side, where food stamps is a tremendous public policy success, and we now have 46 million people on food stamps, and thankfully we have that. We've totally destroyed, almost totally destroyed cash assistance for mothers and children. TANF, temporary assistance for needy families. We now have states where it's almost non-existent. In the state of Wyoming, there are 644 people in the entire state on TANF. That's 4% of the poor children in the state of Wyoming. Unbelievable. 19 states where less than 20% of the children are in families receiving cash assistance. It's just not only that the benefits are low, which they always have been in many states, but that it just literally doesn't exist in so many states. And so you see the work that Jason DeParle did a couple of years ago, where he found that there are 6 million people in this country whose only income is from food stamps. That's at a third of the poverty line. 6 million people, 2% of the American people, whose only income is from food stamps. Totally astonishing. And yet you have people running for president, people particularly the House of Representatives, saying that people are abusing this program, it ought to be given to the states, who of course know better than anybody else, and it's an ugly politics that has absolutely no substantive basis. And what we should be talking about is that we need to have a decent safety net for the people at the very bottom. All those people we now have in deep poverty, that's income below half the poverty line. In other words, below $11,000 for that family of 4. We now have 20.5 million people. And even when you take the public benefits that are not counted the way we measure poverty, it's still 14 or 15 million people with these unbelievably low incomes. It's gone up. It was, in 1976, it was 3.3% of the American people who were in deep poverty. And that went up in 2010 to 6.7%, double in 40 years. So we need to be looking at wages, we need to be looking at the safety net, we need to be focusing on place, because again, Sean, you dramatized those figures about the increased segregation, and we know there are concentration effects that are very connected to some of the worst problems in schooling, to the children growing up in those neighborhoods. And of course, we need to have race on the table overtly in our conversation, along with everything else. And the question of race in the 21st century is very heavily the question of education, as well as in the functioning of our criminal justice system. So, very short message, if you will, that we're not going to get to where we want to be unless we add to, combine our efforts on the schools, everything we're doing, and doing that better, but doing everything that we can do about the schools, unless we combine it with a frontal attack on poverty in this country.
Okay, everyone hear me? Okay, good afternoon. So I'm going to pick up from Sean and Peter and what Peter said about what can schools do. So I have in a very short period of time to discuss the question of what can our public education, our public schools, and our public education systems do about poverty. And along the way, I guess I'll raise or get into a little bit, or at least implicate the sort of crazy debate we're having in the United States now in education circles about whether it's poverty or whether it's education. So let me start out, since I'm in Washington, D.C., to remind everybody that the public education system in the United States is a state matter. This is the ultimate states' rights issue. It always has been, with a tradition or mythology about local control, but the truth is the states run our public systems. We have no, unlike other countries in the world that were put up there, we have no national right to education in our U.S. Constitution, as everyone knows. And as a result of the Rodriguez decision back in 1974, there's really no federal, even compelling interest under the United States Constitution in terms of educating the nation's youth. So we have a state system. Kids have a constitutional right to education in the United States, but it's embedded in the 50 state constitutions. The states run the systems. Frankly, all the issues regarding education policy are controlled by the states. So the issue of how schools are governed, charter schools, school districts, all of these things, mayoral control, they're matters of state policy. The extent to which we rely on property tax to fund public education is a state decision. So the way to think about, we need to kind of remind ourselves, and oftentimes here in Washington we sort of act as though we have a national education system. We don't. We have 50 state educational systems. And frankly, the problem we have in public education is that we have so many of our states that are dragging the whole country down educationally in terms of those achievement gaps. We have a number of states that have actually made investments of the type that have been talked about, where I'll point out are relatively high performing even on international benchmarks. But we have a lot of states, a lot of states that are not making the investments they need to make and are essentially taking the whole country down the drain educationally. So the question is, how are states dealing with poverty in schools? We also have a crazy debate about, well, is it outside school factors, inside school factors? We need to get past that. The question is, well, how can states construct equitable systems of public education, of public schools, that ensure that all kids have access or have the ability to achieve the kinds of standards, educational standards that are necessary to get them ready for the workforce and for college, including low-income kids, kids in poverty, English language learners, kids with disabilities, and the like. That's what I mean by equity. And so the question is, what are states doing to address concentrated poverty in our schools? And I want to start out with this slide, which is a bit of a take from Sean's poverty data. to look at concentrated poverty in public schools. And the fact of the matter is that what's happening with this growing poverty that's been talked about is the concentration of poor kids in public schools and public school systems, and frankly, in entire state systems, is growing. That's an enormous issue that we have to confront. So we have so many districts across the country in which the poverty concentration in free and reduced price lunch terms for educators is 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90%. And we have whole states now in which almost the public school population is well above 50% in terms of poverty rates, and even growing. California, the biggest public school system in the United States, 6 million kids, 51% of those kids are in poverty. So the backdrop message is growing concentrated student poverty in our schools, and frankly, in the education debates that we have today, we're not talking about how difficult it is to get those achievement gaps narrowed when you have such concentrated student need in schools. I can't emphasize that anymore. It's not on the discussion, it's got to be back on the table. It's how hard it is for teachers, staff, to deal with school, boosting achievement gaps when 60, 70, 80, 90% of the kids who are coming into the school every day are low income, or English language learners, or both, and have other special needs such as disability. So I want to talk about school finance, though. How do you do this? Which one? I want to talk about school finance because it starts, Linda had the pie thing, and it starts with school finance. Our school finance systems have never been, and to this day are not built to deal with concentrated student poverty. So I want to talk about how our state's funding their schools. It's so critical to having the staff, programs, and services you need to deal with schools serving high concentrations of low-income students. So here's a definition that we use in this report. I handed some of them out in front. Our national report card that we issued last year is School Funding Fair, looking at the 50 states. So what you want to have today, if we're going to get to where we need to go, are state finance systems driven by student need. So in other words, if you have a district or school with higher concentrations of student need, i.e. poverty, the finance system should be constructed so as to deliver more resources, state and local, to those schools, right? That's what they do in those high-performing countries that we're compared to. So you want to have finance systems where poor kids get more, poor schools get more. And frankly, the national sort of scandal, if you will, for the last 50 years is that our state finance systems provide more resources in low-poverty schools versus high-poverty schools. So if you're in a more affluent district that has all those enrichment advantages that Sean put up, you're actually getting more resources from the state finance system than if you're in a school that has much greater need. So a progressive system is one that does allocate more resources driven by student need. Regressive is the other direction that I just mentioned. And flat is you're just flat. So this is what it looks like. So this is the way we should be looking at the state finance systems. What we want to do is move to systems that are like the green line. So that kids that are in high poverty districts are guaranteed the extra resources they need, for the extra programs they need, including early childhood, full-day kindergarten, and the like, so that, as the New Jersey Supreme Court said back in 1990, we can wipe out the disadvantages that kids bring with them to school as much as a school can. Obviously, schools can't deal with the safety net issues and all of that, and Peter's exactly right. But we do have this responsibility to build systems of schools, of public schools, that address the effects of poverty when the kids cross the schoolhouse door every day as much as they can. So here's some of the states. And it's a very sad, this is a very sad state of affairs. Nevada, regressive, very regressive. These are all low spending states, by the way. Colorado is a state in which the school trial judge just about 2 months ago ruled that the entire state finance system was unconstitutional for the reasons that I just talked about. So these are states that do not spend much and are deeply regressive. This is an interesting one because you can see the New York, New Jersey comparison. New Jersey has made, by court decision, a lot of investments of state dollars in high poverty schools so that the tilt goes upward. It's a progressive state. New York, on the other hand, is very high spending, deeply regressive. So if you're in Utica, Rochester, Buffalo, you're getting substantially less in your schools than kids in Westchester County or Long Island. The South is just, I mean, they don't spend anything on education, basically. Not how else to say it. And they're regressive too. So they're regressive. So if you're in a poorer district, you're typically getting less than if you're in a middle class or more affluent district. Out west, it's the same thing. California's, now this is 2009 data, so it's not picking up the effects of the recession. These are going to get worse. It also doesn't show what's going to happen, what we expect to see when all of the federal arrow money goes away, or has gone away. Illinois is the most regressive public finance system in the United States. Poor kids in Illinois are really in bad shape, as are kids of color. Deeply regressive. And this gives you these are funding levels. You can see at the top what Wyoming spends, down to the bottom, Tennessee spends hardly anything on its public system. This is the distribution across the poverty curve. 30% poverty translates into free and reduced lunch for all you educators, around 60% free and reduced price lunch. So you can see some of these differences. Illinois, $11,000 typically if you're in a low poverty district, goes down to $8,700 if you're in a high poverty district. Think of Chicago and the surrounding metro area. Chicago doesn't have enough money to compete in its own teacher labor market for quality teachers. Now, funding effort is, so we always hear the state politicians and the folks here talk, oh, well, we're taxed too late, we can't afford it. The truth is, many of these states spend very little of their state economic GDP on education. So a lot of these low-spending states actually have a lot of fiscal capacity they can do substantially better than what they're doing today. And you see that the states that put out actually tend to have better, more equitable finance systems. Now, I don't want to make the argument here that putting money in automatically results in test score increases. Please don't take what I'm saying for that purpose. But if you just correlate NAEP scores against funding equity on our measures, the states that put the money in, particularly into the high poverty districts, and remember, unless states are driving their state aid into the higher poverty, low wealth, high poverty communities, that's necessary to offset the reliance of our finance systems on the property tax, right? So these are states that drive, not only raise more state revenue, they also drive it towards higher poverty settings. And it turns out that these are the states that do the best perform the best on NAEP, and actually, as I mentioned earlier, do very well on international benchmarks against all the high-flying countries of the world. States like Massachusetts, New Jersey, Minnesota, and Vermont. These are states that do perform high on international benchmarks. Top 5 in some instances or more, and they do very well on NAEP. It's just that these other states are really, as I said before, dragging the whole country educationally down. I took these from Linda. This is what happens when you do invest. We invested in a lot in New Jersey in high poverty schools under the Abbott decisions, and you can see that everything's kind of, the gaps are narrowing, basically. Everything's going up, but the poor kids are going up faster than the other kids. So you start to see the gaps narrowing. Question whether this is going to happen, continue to happen, because a lot of what we're talking about is now under attack in New Jersey. But you can see about how we have to build stronger systems for the future of the state, the state's economy, the state's democracy, and so forth and so on. As Peter said, it's a tough question. And I would say it plays out differently in different places.
I want to take at least 1 or 2 more questions before we wrap up, and I think there's someone here in the front row who's been, right here, who's been waiting patiently.
Amanda Brown with the Public Education Network. Just as an aside, actually, our member local education funds have been doing a lot of work and been quite successful in some high poverty districts in trying to engage the public. So it's another session, but there are some practices and some models out there. My question for the panel is really just a much broader one, which has to do with how did we get here? Peter, you laid out some really stunning data about increasing poverty, and Sean as well, and David, the conversation about education. I mean, how did public education become the whipping boy? Where there's so much disinvestment, to use your term, and there's so many alternatives that are proposed that really increase that disinvestment. You talked about anger, Peter. Is it anger? Is it apathy? How did we get here?
I get all these questions. Well, how we got here is I guess I have basically an answer that relates to the economy more than anything else, going back now over 40 years. The descent starts on the political side with Vietnam and Watergate. The people used to be very had great respect for government. There was a lot of trust in government. And it's been going pretty much steadily down with the bump in 2008 and not too much else. So those blows to our confidence in government in my view, go hand in hand with the deterioration of the economy for most Americans over the last 40 years. Well, the rich were enriching themselves. And what unfortunately makes me pessimistic is that you've had the most powerful interests in the country gradually getting more of a stranglehold on our politics. So it becomes a self-fulfilling, increasingly self-fulfilling prophecy. Citizens United is both a consequence of that power, because who were the 5 justices that voted for it, and how did they get there, and then a further cause of further stranglehold. Now, I don't understand, frankly, how it is that these very powerful people who are only so successful because of the quality of the structure that we have in this country, both economic and political, would not see that it's in their self-interest for every child in this country to be educated well. And so I would hope that with some effort over a period of time, we could get I guess I'd say 2 things. One is that they would see it as in their self-interest. That may be totally naive. But the other is we have had times in the history of this country where people finally did say, like in the movie Nashville, I'm angry and I'm not going to take it anymore. And so if you look at the progressive era, that's what happened. Without the benefit of the Great Depression or World War II, which were other times that instigated great progressive change in this country. So I think there could come a time where people get so angry for the right reasons as opposed to some misguided anger right now, and you have a different politics, which is really what you need.
And I would add that, I would add 2 things. The first is that I actually think that this really, the issues that we've spoken about today, the inequity, the basic ignoring of poverty's impact on education, has been something that really hasn't mattered to many people up until now. It's only until now that we've actually, or it's only recently that we've seen research like Sean's that actually bring to light the implications of what is being practiced in our nation's schools. And it's only recently that we've actually seen how those implications may actually play out and directly affect each and every one of us. But up until now, I mean, a lot of the statistics that we've spoken about and the sobering data that has been shared, it's not new. This has been the circumstance for children, for many children of color, for just about all children living in poverty, for just about all children who have disabilities, many kids who are learning English. This has been their circumstance for decades. And it's only now coming to light because of the research that's been highlighted here in movements like Border Vote. So I think that has to be kept in mind. This is something that we as a nation are just waking up to now, but it's been in our own backyard, literally for many of us, for lifetimes at this point. The other thing that I would suggest is that the conversation regarding education and how to address the things that have been discussed today is incredibly short-sighted. I mean, there are very few venues that will actually get past the false dichotomy of supposed school reform versus status quo, or someone who's a proponent of teachers' unions versus someone who is a proponent of charters. I mean, these are incredibly short-sighted conversations that we're having about an issue that is clearly very profound. And in terms of how to actually reach and engage people, we actually have to deepen the conversation and actually show if people want to engage in this conversation, I think everyone should, then we also have to understand a lot of the intricacies of it. This isn't just a matter of teachers' unions. This isn't just a matter of charter schools. Neither are the enemy of the prosperity of public education, and neither are the salvation of it. All right? So we need to actually understand the intricacies of these things. And we actually have to have cooler conversations than especially what's been going on here in Congress.
I'm going to bring this publicly to a close. I want to let people who've been incredibly patient and are legitimately tired of talking about poverty go. I want to give a few people, kind of brave and patient souls, a chance to come up here and talk with the panelists. I want to end this, of course, with a thank you, but I want to end on a note that I think is, sounds pessimistic, but I think oddly might be a response to how we get through this and how we make this an issue. And they sound like two bad things, but I think that they may be leverage points for how we get some traction on this. The first one is the reality that a lot more of us are poor than have been in a very long time. So being poor and being lower middle class and living just around 200% of the poverty applies to an awful lot of people in this country. That in itself is a really bad thing. At the same time, it really unites people in a way that it hasn't in a long time. Because all of a sudden, the poor are not them, they're us. And if they're not us, we are awfully close to it and a lot more aware than we ever have been before that we are really close to being there, and that we're a paycheck away, or an illness away, or a car crash away. And I think that really gives us an opportunity to unite in a way that we haven't. And the other thing I'll say, because people ask me when I go to events, they say, but how are you going to get past all this rhetoric about it's not about poverty, it's not, and I say, the bad thing is, I think the fact that the policies, the so-called reforms that are being promoted are imploding so openly at this point, and are so lacking, not only in the evidentiary base, but in the ability to get anywhere, I think that itself is what is going to get us traction. But that's obviously not how we want to get traction. We have all this evidence about what works, and that hasn't got us where we want to get. But if the objective is getting us where we want to get, and if the failure of other ostensibly effective policies is what gets us there, the bottom line is that we are going to get there. And so I think all of us, part of our job is to talk about the fact, loudly, openly, and assertively, that they don't work. That we need to open the discussion, we need to be more honest, we need to be a lot bolder than we have been. And on that, I'll thank everybody, especially the fantastic panel, and welcome anyone who's still got, any, energy left to come on up and talk to us. Thank you.
As Sean mentioned, research indicates that lower income toddlers and infants actually come into school testing lower on cognitive assessments than infants and toddlers from higher income families. In 2008, the event dropout rate for students living in poverty was about 4.5 times higher than students from higher income families. And even looking at district funding, David already went through some of the state level issues. but a recent report by the Department of Education notes that per pupil expenditures often vary considerably across schools in districts, and that nearly half of all districts had per pupil expenditures that were more than 10% above or below the district average. So with each of these steps, with each of these points of inequality, children are actually being pushed further from the mainstream of society. Those children that are pushed further from the mainstream of society by lack of educational opportunity become adults who are completely disenfranchised from society. So the first step that federal education policy can take towards addressing the impact of poverty on educational opportunity is to retain the strong role of federal government. And this has been a really contentious conversation here in DC and also across the country. And we can talk about the foibles of current laws accountability framework and the one-size-fits-all nature of NCLB. But the idea that federal law requires all schools to serve all students equally in receipt or in exchange for federal funds is a precious idea that we need to maintain. And we need to maintain how comprehensive that idea is practiced. How comprehensive that idea is practiced. And as a product of decades of civil rights struggles, the federal role ensures that that will happen. The second step to addressing the impact of poverty on education opportunity is to acknowledge and affirmatively address the disparities that exist between schools. Economic disparities, among others, are actually some of the most important because they have the upfront issue of depriving schools of the opportunity to provide students with equal access to books and technology, other necessities. But there's also the issue that economic disparities deprive schools of the opportunity to actually compete for and attract, retain, and develop fully prepared and effective teachers. And David touched on that during the last portion of his presentation. Chicago, for example, can't compete with other districts in its periphery for the best teachers. So you have a whole bunch of schools that are poorly funded within Chicago schools that simply don't have access to fully prepared and effective teachers. And we can actually, and we already know the results of that. You see disparate outcomes. The Fiscal Fairness Act, which was actually introduced here in the Senate and in the House this session, will actually address economic disparities between schools within the same district by improving and strengthening current law's comparability framework. The third step to addressing the impact of poverty on educational opportunity is to make strategic investments in low-income communities and the schools within them. David already spoke about the need for high-quality, full-day preschool. And we need to make sure that high-quality, full-day preschool is actually democratized, and all students who live in low-income communities should have equal access to high-quality, full-day preschool. And it shouldn't be dependent on whether that state wins a competition for additional federal dollars. We need to build space within ESEA, within codified law, to make sure that all students who are living in less wealthy circumstances have access to highly effective full-day preschool. Wraparound services, such as healthcare clinics and the provision of social services, also need to be integrated into schools in less wealthy areas. And along with them, support staff, like guidance counselors or social workers, need to be included in schools in numbers that ensure manageable caseloads for those staff members and meaningful interaction between students and staff. Additional learning opportunities, primarily through extended learning programs that have track records for success in promoting student learning. And summer learning opportunities that not only abate the loss of knowledge between school years, but also expand students' horizons need to be provided through codified federal law. The Time for Innovation Matters in Education Act, or TIME Act, which has bipartisan support, is something that is a bill that needs to actually get authorized and be supported because it provides a great framework for doing this. The fourth step is actually one that's pretty familiar to, I'm sure, a lot of people here, and that has to do with teachers and school leaders. So, as a bit of background, before a controversial amendment was inserted into a continuing resolution in late 2010, current law required that teachers who had not yet completed their certification programs were not allowed to teach low-income or minority students at disproportionate rates. As a result of that amendment, though, which was surreptitiously inserted to the continuing resolution, such teachers who have not completed their certification programs, are now permissibly titled highly qualified. And in the eyes of the law, there's almost no differentiation between them. Forget about if you're a parent or community member and you want to try to find a teacher who has more experience in a classroom or has some developed expertise. That information is effectively masked because of this amendment. So, in addition to inexperienced teachers, though, there's also the problem of churn or turnover within the school's teacher staff and school leadership. And students of color bear the brunt of this, and this is revealed through the most recent civil rights data collection. And black students are actually twice as likely to have teachers with only 1 or 2 years of experience than white students within the same district. That's within the same district. These are kids who probably go to school in very close proximity, but they are worlds apart in terms of the educational opportunity provided to them. So we have to face the fact that however motivated they may be, beginning teachers are still learning the fundamentals of their craft when they enter the classroom. But our most vulnerable students need access to the most effective and fully prepared teachers on day one. And research backs up this idea. We've all heard the summaries of research that indicate that teachers become more effective as they accrue years of experience in the classroom. And we need to make sure that federal policy ensures that when teachers enter the classroom, they're fully prepared to do so. The focus of these measures should be to ensure that students who need access to fully prepared and effective teachers, students who are either living in low-income households or students who have special learning needs, should have equal, if not better, access to those fully prepared and effective teachers. And again, there's a place for federal policy to actually engender this change. We want to make sure that teachers of record, when they enter a classroom, are fully prepared to do so, and that requires federal law to set a high bar for entry into the profession and the classroom. The Assuring Successful Students Through Effective Teaching Act, or ASSET Act, provides a great framework to accomplish this goal as well. And it provides that all students, especially students from low-income homes, students of color, students who have disabilities, or students who are learning English, would be provided by teachers who are fully prepared as soon as they enter the classroom and who, once they're proved themselves to be effective. It would also provide some actual meaning to the definition, the federal definition of highly qualified teacher, which again was eroded by Department of Education regulations and this controversial amendment that was slipped into the continuing resolution in December of 2010. It would also ensure that teachers who are fully prepared and effective would be equitably distributed. So again, there would be a huge push in terms of equity to make sure that fully prepared teachers and effective teachers are democratized. And lastly, in order to thrive, teachers need instructional leadership and mentorship from other teachers who have proven themselves to be experts at promoting student achievement. And I'm talking about student achievement broadly defined by multiple measures. We're not just talking about test scores. We can talk about the fallacious notion that test scores actually lead to significant gains, and that test scores are the best way to measure student performance. Teachers also need leadership from principals who have shown that they know how to manage and develop staff, while also creating educationally sound and positive learning environments. And Congress's will to support these measures will have really far-reaching effects. If a reauthorized ESEA does not contain these measures, we'll simply continue to see the growth of disparities that have already been described. And as those disparities deepen, the chasms between people in our society will broaden. As our late president and director counsel at the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, John Payne, often said, our nation's democracy is based on the idea that all people are including we the people. There should be no more democratic or inclusive institution in our country than public education. But to realize its value, to remain true to the civil rights core of ESEA, we have to make sure that we take deliberate steps to address the inequitable inputs and inequitable outputs or outcomes of our educational system. And we have to make sure that we actually provide all students equal opportunities to learn.
Thank you all so much. I obviously don't need to emphasize how passionate all four of these panelists are about what we're talking about today, or the critical importance that they place on this issue. I really want to get out to all of you in the audience to ask questions. So I have three pretty short ones that I think are kind of the requisite sort of questions that a moderator should ask of the panelists. The first one, Eric, I think really hit very, very well. So you're welcome to go ahead and provide another response, but this is really directed to the three of you. So there are really two signature federal pieces of education legislation. I'm going to start narrow here and get broader in my questions. These two signature pieces of legislation that are really being discussed now, the SCA, No Child Left Behind, and then the other is Race to the Top. One really drives state level and district level decisions through money. The other one really drives it a lot through much smaller money, but a lot of incentives and publicity. I'm going to ask each of you, limited to those two pieces of legislation, if you could pick the single most important change you would make as those are reconsidered or reauthorized, what would it be? And this is a little bit different from what I told them I'd ask them, so we'll see what happens spontaneously. Oh, come on, you guys have a lot of opinions.
Well, you know, I'm not a big fan of either. And as I said before, I think we need a whole new vision of what federal education policy should be. But these are, both of these are focused on the wrong, or let's put it this way. There's a lot of focus in these on districts and schools and now teachers, turning around low-performing schools, 5% low-performing, you know, all this stuff, teacher evaluations. When these laws should be rewritten to focus on the states, and making sure, and really focusing on what the states need to do to build systems of strong public schools. So strong teacher workforce systems. It's the only way we're going to get at the teacher equity and all of these sort of local problems. So that's a general comment. One thing I would do is and we've written metrics like this. I mean, I would put metrics in one. You know, you could do it. You'd like to see a race to the top. I don't like competitive grants. But if we're going to do competitive grants, I would do it around school finance reform. Let's have a race to the top in terms of creating more fairness in our funding systems and offer money to states to compete for that so that they can build the kinds of finance systems that we need. The other thing I would do is put in some metrics that require states to, at the very least, maintain certain levels of effort of state and local resources in return for getting federal dollars. I don't want to get into the details of that. I've got metrics about that. I'd love to see federal law say, look, we'll give you Title I money or Race to the Top money or whatever it is, but at the very least, you can't cut your budgets. You can't cut state aid out of those budgets, because that always hurts the poorest kids in poor schools. You've got to at the very least maintain certain levels of effort if you want this money. And I'd like to see some metrics that actually that are tied to what I put up on the board, that would sort of push states, incentivize states, to do a better job towards moving towards these what I would call standards-based finance systems that ensure all kids the kinds of resources they need to achieve rigorous standards.
So I would add, so one of the features of No Child Left Behind, the current ESE law, is its emphasis sort of on accountability based on quantifiable outputs, generally standardized test scores. And what it assumes is that schools and districts just sort of aren't trying hard enough and aren't being innovative enough, and that if pressured to perform, they'll figure out how to do it. And you know, as in any profession, when you have 3 million teachers, there probably are some who aren't trying as hard as they could. But what's more happening, I think, is that folks don't either have the resources or the capacity, or they're sort of struggling with an overburdened system. And so I think we still need to measure outcomes, because I think they're really important. They let us look at how we're doing in lots of ways. But I think what we need is a set of policies that are focused more on making sure that schools and teachers have the right resources to enable them to do the job they want to do well. People don't go into teaching because they're going to make a lot of money. Teaching is a profession that many people go into because of its intrinsic rewards. It's enjoyable to teach. It's enjoyable to help young people grow. But ask any teacher, it's often hard to do that in a system without a lot of resources. Ask Teach for America teachers who, are idealistic, ambitious people who get put into disadvantaged systems and often struggle mightily trying to figure out how to do it. It's not that people don't want to do it or that they're not trying, I think. I think it's a matter of providing the right resources, providing the better training, things like that.
And to reiterate one of the points that I made during my presentation, there are actually a number of policies that are in federal law right now that come close to doing some of the things that were just discussed. There are concepts like comparability and maintenance of effort that are part of Title I that actually call for comparability between schools within the same district. And there's a rule that actually calls for, within the comparability provisions of Title I, 10% parity. But again, that hasn't been enforced by the Department of Education. And you can argue about whether retracting federal dollars from school districts that have either inequitably distributed funding in the first place is a good idea. But the point is that there's a very important role for the federal government to be present in those decisions and to make sure that there is some version of accountability that's exacted upon states and school districts that either cannot or will not do right by schools and students. And the idea that these policies have come under attack, which is actually happening full bore in the House this year, the most recent proposal that's been made regarding Title I, completely decimated Title I. It shoved a whole bunch of other areas of the ACA into Title I, made it a block grant, got rid of maintenance of effort, opened up Title I funds to a whole bunch of other funding areas, which would then, by virtue of opening them up, diffuse those funds, which are already scarce. The idea that those policies that ensure that there's some degree of equity within the system are under attack is an incredibly scary one. And I think that if I have to respond to the question, obviously I'm going to, I would reiterate that there is a need for a refined and incredibly strong role for the federal government to, at the very least, ensure that there is a minimum level of service provided to every kid who attends a school that receives federal funds.
Even though, given where we are, obviously we have to talk about federal policy, and it matters a lot as far as both some funding and also as just the bully pulpit and setting the stage. As we all discussed, however, states are where the action's happening. David actually went into this, I think, in some really, really nice detail. I'd love to hear from the others of you, partly because I think there should be some right notes, even in a very somber hearing, about what's going on in states that might be good. States have really weathered and gone through and made decisions in the recent recession in very different ways. And I'm wondering if any of you could speak to a set of decisions that you think has been particularly helpful, that can serve as a model for other states going forward, that's done a better job of protecting children, protecting education, and protecting low-income families and communities, both because as we go forward, states are continuing to face issues of cuts, and because this will happen again. And what can we do that would be smarter and that does less damage? And it'd be great to hear actual, concrete examples. I'm assuming there are.
Well, I can try to kick it off. So I'll start with the disclaimer that all of my work focuses at the federal level. So there's only a certain degree of detail that I can provide when talking about state stuff. One of the biggest things that's happened this year is actually the provision of waivers to states from certain provisions of No Child Left Behind accountability framework. And there have been a whole bunch of applications that have been submitted from states. I think 37 already, and there's another round coming up in September. And then there's also word that dispensation from federal accountability laws would be extended directly to districts. So there's a lot that's happening, but one of the bright spots is that some states have actually tried to move past the short-sighted metrics that are now required by federal law and create different indexes that would look at different school outputs and outcomes. And one of the states that's actually done this the best is Massachusetts. And we've already heard how high-performing state Massachusetts is already, but one of the pieces about their waiver application that I would laud is that they moved away from a focus on standardized test scores. And there's, we can argue about whether there's a place for standardized test scores, but current law actually requires a laser-like focus on standardized test scores, and because of that focus, I think all of the educators here know there's been a huge number of spillover effects. All of them are negative in our national education policies and practices. So Massachusetts has created an index that allows them to evaluate schools based on a number of different indicia. Some of them that we've actually promoted are school climate, so discipline rates. One of the spillover effects of No Child Left Behind's accountability framework and its laser-like focus on test scores is that students have been pushed out of school because they're deemed threats to the school's ability to perform. So if you have students with disabilities, if you have students who simply need differentiation, you can't work with those students, or teachers may not be able to work with those students because they have to hit certain pacing, they have to hit points within the sequences of lessons, and then they have to prepare students to perform on the test. And when a school doesn't perform, No Child Left Behind's one-size-fits-all accountability framework slams down on them with complete and blinded sanctions. So Massachusetts has actually moved in a really positive direction by diversifying the metrics that they use to evaluate schools and allowing some idiosyncrasy to the way that schools are evaluated. There's a number of different ways that districts can actually evaluate the schools, and that the state has proposed to do so. And so I would submit that moving away from standardized test scores is something that Massachusetts as a state has done well.
Let me get one more nomination here, and then what I'd like to do is open it up to the audience for two things. First of all, if there's people out there who'd like to talk about districts or states that they feel have done a great job, terrific, and also go ahead and just raise your hand to pose a question. We've got two kind of roving microphones out there for you.
No, I mean, most of my work, it looks at these national trends, so we started looking at which states are looking better over time on these outcomes. But we just started that project and to try to figure out, which ones are doing a good job, not just raising achievement, but sort of narrowing the disparities. And there's a wide variety across states in how fast they're narrowing the disparities, or in some cases widening them. But we're just starting to try to figure out if we can tease out which policies in those states seem to be most responsible for that.
So let me make a comment on this. One thing I want to say about comparability, the federal comparability point, is that, to just quickly, is the issue of funding disparity is largely an issue of between district disparity in states, not within school, district, school. To some extent, comparability, I'm all for it, but, in many places, because of the high poverty concentration in the districts and the disparity in the state systems, which we point out, which is among districts, comparability will kind of be a bit of moving deck chairs around the Titanic. We're saying we're going to have middle-class schools and middle-class neighborhoods that have to get rid of AP courses so that we can get remedial reading. And we shouldn't be having that conversation. It should be about lifting everybody's boats up. So comparability is okay, but it's not going to take us where we need to go. Secondly, about the states. If the goal is equity, the states are going in the wrong direction. There aren't a lot of models right now. In fact, there's a lot of what I would put up there as sort of going down, even going further down the path towards inequity, resegregation, whatever you want to call it. I mean, witness Louisiana, what's going on in Louisiana right now. And part of the problem in Louisiana is that over 20% of all the kids 6 to 16 school age are not in the public system, and the income differential between the households that are in public schools and in non-public schools is almost 3 to 1. So all the wealthy folks who run the state don't use the public system. So the unwillingness of these states to make the kinds of investments in systems that are increasingly dominated by poor kids who don't have the political power is leading us down these paths to these, what I call real distraction solutions that are not going to build the kind of equitable systems that we need. These kinds of crazy teacher evaluation programs based on the use of tests, voucher programs. I could go on and on and on. It's not going to take us where we need to go. So right now in the states, it's kind of grim out there, frankly, and there are not a lot of models. Some states are trying to hang on, like Massachusetts and New Jersey, kind of they built up some equity. It's all under attack. New Jersey, it's under attack. We're doing a pretty good job of kind of hanging on. But I don't see the sort of proactive, aggressive agenda in any state right now that says we have to build this strong, equitable system throughout the state for all kids and begin to make the investments both in fiscal capacity and human capacity in the State Department of Education, local school districts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, to get the kind of ongoing instructional improvement that we desperately need. So I hate to be a pessimist.
All right, so raise your hands really high, because remember, they have to see you from behind. All right.
Hi, I'm Jerome Dances. I'm a retired mathematics professor. And the view from the colleges is that students are showing up knowing considerably less arithmetic and algebra than they did 10 years ago and 20 years ago. Now, I agree with almost all that I've heard from the panel, but there are things which I think are underneath the radar, which I'd be curious to what extent that you're aware of. Now, to close the racial gap or any education gap, the hard way is to raise up the bottom. The easy way is to pull down the top. And that's largely what's been happening. And that's why, in fact, I could say in my state of Maryland, when we look at the number of percent of students who know arithmetic when they get to college, the gap has been closing. That's because, while there are considerably less blacks who know arithmetic than they did 10 years ago, the percentage of whites who don't know arithmetic is even larger. Now, since we're talking about the government,
Right. I want to make sure everybody who asks a question poses a question.
Okay. Are you aware that the federal government has been financing big time education programs which downgrade arithmetic? They don't say that. What they say is we're going to have teach arithmetic with technology. So the students are all doing it with calculators and they're not learning arithmetic. So are you aware that the federal government is financing big time educational programs which downgrade arithmetic and not financing programs that upgrade arithmetic?
So, no, I'm not aware of that. But more importantly, while I understand that many of us feel like skills are going down over time, when we look at NAEP, which is giving the same math test to children since 1978 to the present day, the average fourth grader now, the average 9-year-old, has the same level of math skills that the average 11-year-old had 30 years ago. When you look at why the gaps have narrowed between blacks and whites, which they have dramatically, it's because black scores have gone up astronomically. Black scores now, used to be a standard deviation below white scores in 1978. Black scores now are higher than white scores were in 1978. That is, blacks have entirely closed the gap that existed in 1978, and white scores have gone up at the same amount of time, though not as fast as black scores, and that's why the gap is narrowed. Nobody's scores have gone down in math. So on a national level, using the same test over the last 30 years, it's simply not true.
Another question.
Another question? I think we've got one right there.
Hi, my name is Allison Criner Brown. I'm Associate Director of Teaching for Change. We provide resources for teachers who are looking to teach beyond the test and also work with parents. And my question, you all have all talked about standardized testing, teaching evaluation, just the current climate of ed reform, which is pushing policies that we both know aren't effective at really getting to the root of the problem, but also aren't policies that are in place in the schools where the people pushing these policies send their kids. So my question is, if you can talk about assessments, not in the sense of accountability, but when we look at what kids are actually learning, and we say race has to be on the table when we're talking about the content of standardized tests, when we're talking about the content of the curriculum, and the kids who really, really need the most help, they don't see themselves in the curriculum. So I'm wondering, and this may be a little too deep in the weeds for some of you all, but if you could talk about what teachers can do, and just, if we're going to talk about education, and there's a lot of talk about the core curriculum, where we need to also move that, so we're not just focusing on just the reading and math scores in these standardized tests, but what else can we do, particularly when so many students in poverty need to be reached in different ways. We have standardized tests, but we tell teachers that they need to teach, to multiple intelligences, so which is a complete contradiction. So if you can just talk about other ways that we can reach students meaningfully.
I'm actually going to take this real quickly and then turn it over to all of you to make kind of a plug for, or explain why BBA takes this issue so seriously, in addition to all the things, the items that we think need to be included in education to address poverty. A really big concern of ours is that this single-minded focus on math and reading skills impoverishes the education precisely of the kids who need enrichment the most. That it's kind of a no-brainer that if teachers' entire incentives and careers are tracked based on math and reading scores, that's where they're going to focus. I mean, the same would be true of a lawyer, a doctor, anyone in any profession. I mean, it's just, seriously, just A-B. It's a very direct line. And that is really our concern. For that reason, we say, first of all, we need to stop that kind of single-minded focus. We're very concerned. We need to re-enrich our curriculum. We need to broaden it. And the other thing we say is we need accountability systems that work, that measure things, and that particularly do not provide the huge disincentives they do now for teachers to teach the kids we want them to teach. To the extent that test scores incorporate everything related to poverty, how well the child slept, how well the child ate, how high the child's stress level is, when a teacher is punished through that child's test scores for teaching children who are highly stressed and hungry and homeless, those teachers aren't going to teach those kids anymore, and they might get fired. So it's really, really important for us to put this in the context of what it means to get and retain great teachers in the hardest to teach schools. For that same reason, we advocate for a much broader system of accountability, things like inspectorates that are complicated, but that look at all aspects of the school, that look at all aspects of the child, that don't focus singly on the teacher, and especially not on the individual teacher, because we know that great teachers and good teaching happens in teams and with the whole school.
Yeah, go right ahead.
Why don't you just make a point on finance side of this? The reason you want to have strong finance systems is you want to ensure that kids in poor schools have access to a rich and rigorous curriculum comparable to what kids in more affluent schools get. So that's why the funding is so important, in order to ensure that you're not just doing reading and language arts and mathematics, but physical education, visual and performing arts, social studies, and the like. So the issue is, the issue of finance is so important to ensure that kids in poor schools have access to that rich and rigorous curriculum and a variety of content. I'll leave it to the educators to debate over the whole issue of assessments, but part of what the standardized testing push has gotten us away from, has kind of distracted us away from the sort of fundamental issue is, are we giving poor kids in poor schools a very rich, rigorous curriculum, variety of content areas, a lot of which are things that maybe are not in reading and mathematics, but are things that are going to tie kids to school and keep them in school, like extracurricular activities, sports, things like that.
I know we've had at least 3 other questions, one here and then one here. One there and then one here.
My name is Bert Wise. I worked in the House and Senate for about 24 years. My son and daughter-in-law are in the trenches in New York City on these issues, and they've explained to me how counterproductive what they call the No Teachers Behind Left Act is. But my work on the Hill was in education, more regarding civil rights. But the experience up there has led me to want to ask a broader question, and it really is relevant very recently I was at a different session in New York about how in the post 9/11 era there have been problems in the decline of civil liberties against national security and the checks and balances vis-a-vis the executive. And there were a lot of suggestions, programmatic suggestions. But to me, the real question is, how do you get the public aroused to influence the people in Congress? They're terrific panel, terrific suggestions. So I would apply the same broader question here with the concern about the deficit, people in middle class who think they're in poverty because their 401k dipped a third, and the Tea Party against federal involvement at the local level. How do any of you think we can get the kind of public involvement and concern voiced strongly enough in Washington, as we have in past reforms, to get members of Congress willing to stick their neck out, let alone fight for all these great suggestions?
I think you got to help people realize how much it's in their own interest, no matter where they are on the economic ladder, to support high-quality education for everyone. The economy depends on it. Increasingly, the economy relies, as Peter says, we have a lot of people who work in low-wage jobs, but the growth in the economy in the future is going to depend on America graduating lots and lots of people with sort of high levels of skills who can go into the sort of high-tech jobs where the future of the economy is. And so,
how do you get the public?
how do you get
the public to we understand the question.
Yeah, I think you have to you have to go out and you have to talk about how much the economy needs education to be good for everyone. That it's not enough for, our educational system is actually quite good if you're on the high end of the income distribution, or if you live in Massachusetts or New Jersey, which are correlated. But we need the education system to be good for everyone. The economy needs it to be good for everyone. And I think that message that maybe needs to be spread more.
You're asking, even though all of us are deeply devoted to this, that's the question, that's the gazillion dollar question. And there isn't really anybody who knows the answer to that question. There's some people who make money advising candidates who pretend they know the answer to that question. But what we do need that we can do something about, is people, I could talk about movements, and I could talk about organizing, and I could talk about the enthusiasm that we had in 2008 and how really a lot of people thought we were going to be headed in the right direction. And one of the things that happened is that a lot of people said, well, now we elected Barack Obama and he'll take care of it and we'll go back to what we were doing. But all of us, if we want to do something about it, the kind of people in this room, is we have to find our own ways to express ourselves. That's what we can do. Whether it's through organizations we're part of, or somehow groups that we join, or what we say ourselves, and in our own work as well. I mean, everybody up here in their own way is obviously working very hard on trying, among other things, to get some thoughtful ideas out to the public. But I think too many people, this is just a little sermon, and I don't think anybody in this room probably needs it anyway. But we're just busy, and we think somebody else will do it, or it's not that important. And just everybody's got to take it on themselves to figure out ways to get these points out there. And it's an uphill battle because people are very angry in this country right now. And they really, there's a barrier to break through to get them to listen to what's actually in their own self-interest for what we need to do. Instead of an easy sell that we should invest in our children, it's now become a harder sell because there are a lot of people who get a lot of attention who want to destroy everything. It's totally irrational. So,
and that's to say you also have to deal with the issue of using those investments effectively and efficiently and all those issues But if you do that and make a concerted effort at it, we can start to narrow some of those gaps. I'm not going to take up Sean's question of whether we can ultimately close them or not. The other thing I want to talk about is preschool. And let me say it this way, because I'm running out of time. And I'm going to pick up on what Sean said. We are not going to close achievement gaps in the United States in our K-12 systems unless we get all 3- and 4-year-old kids, and particularly low-income kids and low-income kids in high-need communities, into well-planned, high-quality preschool starting at age 3. It is a pipe dream, as Sean pointed out, to think that the kind of current school reform agenda, which is focused on testing and teacher evaluations and changing governance from public schools to charter schools, and I'm not here to argue about those things, but those things are not going to, we know, we've been down this path before, those things are not going to bring about these equitable investments in building strong systems of public education for all kids. And frankly, the other thing we have to do is we have to start public education at age 3. What do I mean by high-quality preschool? We did it in New Jersey. One of the big investments we got was in our Abbott preschool program. Class size of 15, developmentally appropriate curriculum linked to K-12 standards. We can use Head Start, blending Head Start, child care, and public school programs together in a unified system. Full day, full school year. I could go on. High quality. It's got to be high quality. All the researchers tell us if we don't do it on a high quality basis, it's not going to pay off. So we have, and this is from NEAR, from the National Institute of Research on Early Education Research. We have very low participation rates in preschool among 4-year-olds. I even put up the 3-year-olds. All the nations in the world that are going past us have all their kids in at 3. France, Spain, take your pick. This is a critical issue. So what can we do? Fair school funding. We've got to get school finance reform back on the reform agenda. As I said, it's the key to teacher quality, all the things that we talk about in education. I want to say that the resistance to this reform in state capitals is deep, it's long-standing, it's always been there. We've never had a golden age of equity in the United States. And it's bipartisan. It's tough. This is an important issue. And frankly, this is where federal policy needs to change. The federal government puts education aid into the states in the form of Title I, ID, and NEAS funding, and just hands it over with no attention to what I talked about, whether these states are putting up for their kids and their poor kids. They hand it over, and what the states do is they turn around and cut their budgets. In other words, the federal government education policy subsidizes, facilitates inequity as far as poor kids are concerned. We have to begin to have a conversation here in Washington about changing that. Now, that's not on the agenda of ESEA reauthorization. And it's going to be a while until we can get this back on the agenda. But we have got to start talking about a new set of federal policies that incentivize the states to make the improvements in their finance systems to turn them towards the progressive dial. And the other issue is preschool. This is where federal policy, and I'll stop at this point, federal policy can really, we have an incoherent federal policy on if you want to even call it that, on the care and education of young children. It's time that we had a serious debate about unifying Head Start, child care, and public school programs at the state level and at the local district level, and a set of federal policies, a national policy that drives the states to do that. This is really where the federal government could say, we are going to set out on a 5, 10, 15, 20-year campaign to get the states to rebuild their systems of preschool early education, in which they are incentivized and supported in building the kind of unified preschool education programs that we have to have. And I'm not going to mention capital, that's a whole other story, but I'll stop there.
All right, so good afternoon, everyone. check in with everyone. Good afternoon. All right. So I have the honor of trying to comment on each of the panelists' different presentations, and I think it's going to make me look really, really smart because I think each of these people have touched on very, very important and obviously pressing issues that we need to attend to immediately. And I think, David, you really set me up pretty well because I think at the base of this is an equity issue. Equity is at the core of this discussion and the problems that we're describing today. The research and the findings discussed today actually illustrate an alarming and strong contrast to the purpose of federal education policy. And as Elaine said at the beginning, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act in particular was started during the War on Poverty in 1965, specifically to offset the financial burdens for districts who had to or wanted to educate concentrations of children living in poverty. And in fact, all education, federal education policy, is aimed at creating equity, engendering equity. At least that's its goal. I'm sure that David would beg to differ with that. But that's the idea, that's the intent behind it. So, in this way, at their core, ESEA and federal education policies are civil rights laws. They're meant to ensure that all children are educated and provided the same services on an equal basis. Today, however, that value and that